The photographer arrived at Natasha Lytess's West Hollywood home at 7 in the morning for what was supposed to be a routine publicity shoot. Life magazine had commissioned a behind-the-scenes piece about how Marilyn Monroe prepared for her roles, and they'd been granted rare access to one of the intensive coaching sessions everyone in Hollywood talked about, but few outsiders ever witnessed. What the photographer saw that morning would never make it into the published article, but his testimony, given years later to Monroe biographers, painted a picture that complicated the official narrative of a simple teacher-student relationship. He found Monroe still in bed in Lytess's bedroom, wearing what appeared to be one of the coach's nightgowns. Lytess was sitting on the edge of the bed, stroking Monroe's hair, speaking to her in Russian, a language Monroe didn't understand, but seemed soothed by anyway. "I thought maybe Monroe had spent the night because they'd worked late," the photographer recalled. "But then I saw how they looked at each other. The intimacy wasn't professional, it was something else entirely." When questioned about the sleeping arrangement, Lytess had a ready explanation. Monroe had nightmares, anxiety attacks that only her coach could calm. They often worked until 3 or 4 in the morning, and it made sense for Monroe to stay rather than drive home exhausted. The explanation was logical, practical, entirely reasonable, but it didn't explain the tenderness in Lytess's eyes when she watched Monroe sleep, or the way Monroe's hand unconsciously sought her coach's touch, or the feeling the photographer couldn't shake that he'd witnessed something private, something that wasn't meant for outside eyes, something that transcended any professional relationship he'd ever seen. Before we continue with this story, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the hidden scandals and untold truths about Hollywood's golden age icons. For 8 years, from 1948 to 1956, Natasha Lytess and Marilyn Monroe existed in a relationship that defied easy categorization. It was professional, certainly. Lytess was Monroe's acting coach, the woman who'd transformed an unknown contract player named Norma Jean into the most recognizable movie star in the world. But it was also something more, something that made studio executives uncomfortable, that drove Monroe's lovers to jealous rage, that fueled Hollywood gossip for decades. The question that no one could definitively answer, that remains unanswered even today, was whether Natasha Lytess had fallen in love with Marilyn Monroe, and if so, whether that love was ever returned. The ambiguity wasn't accidental. In 1950s Hollywood, certain things could not be spoken aloud. The Hays Code governed what could appear on screen, but an equally powerful code of silence governed what could be acknowledged about the private lives of stars and the people who surrounded them. Same-sex relationships, especially involving women as famous as Monroe, existed in a shadowy realm of rumor and innuendo, never quite confirmed but never entirely denied. Lytess and Monroe's relationship occupied this space, interpreted differently by everyone who witnessed it, but never fully explained by the two women at its center. The first hints that something unusual was developing between coach and student emerged as early as 1949, just a year into their intensive work together. Monroe had moved into Lytess's home, ostensibly for concentrated preparation for an upcoming role. But weeks turned into months, and Monroe showed no signs of moving out. Studio secretaries noticed that phone calls between the two women, even when they'd just parted hours earlier, had a quality of longing that seemed disproportionate to professional necessity. Lytess would call Monroe's dressing room between takes just to hear her voice. Monroe would panic if she couldn't reach Lytess immediately when she needed reassurance. Directors who worked with Monroe during this period described the dynamic in terms that, looking back, carried unmistakable undertones. Fritz Lang, who directed Monroe in Clash by Night in 1952, told an interviewer that watching Lytess and Monroe together reminded him of a love affair, the way one partner anticipates the other's needs, the way they communicate without words. When asked to clarify, Lang backtracked, insisting he'd meant only that their professional partnership was unusually close, but the comparison had been made, and others noticed the same patterns. The living arrangement between Lytess and Monroe, which continued intermittently throughout their 8-year collaboration, became one of the most scrutinized aspects of their relationship. Lytess lived in a modest but comfortable house in West Hollywood, and Monroe had her own bedroom there, decorated to her specifications. But neighbors reported seeing lights burning in Lytess's bedroom at all hours, hearing two women's voices in conversation, or sometimes just silence broken by occasional laughter or crying. The postman who delivered to the house later told reporters that he often saw Monroe in the morning, wearing a robe, collecting the mail as if she lived there permanently. What happened behind those closed doors? The official explanation was always work. They were rehearsing scenes, analyzing performances, doing the intensive preparation that Monroe's growing stardom required, and certainly, work was happening. The transformation in Monroe's abilities between 1948 and 1952 was dramatic and documented, but the amount of time they spent together went beyond what any professional relationship seemed to require. 18-hour days that stretched into sleepovers, phone calls that lasted 3 hours discussing what should have been simple questions about scene interpretation, a level of emotional dependency that even Monroe's therapists would later identify as unhealthy. Nothing revealed the true nature of Lytess's feelings for Monroe more clearly than her reactions to the men in her student's life. With each boyfriend, each husband, each romantic interest, Lytess displayed a pattern of behavior that went far beyond professional concern. She criticized their intelligence, their understanding of Monroe's needs, their ability to support her career. She found reasons why Monroe shouldn't see them, shouldn't marry them, shouldn't prioritize them over the work. And when Monroe ignored these warnings, Lytess's behavior became increasingly territorial and desperate. Joe DiMaggio experienced the full force of Lytess's possessiveness. From the moment he began courting Monroe in 1952, Lytess made her opposition clear. She told Monroe that DiMaggio was intellectually beneath her, that he didn't understand art or ambition, that he would try to turn her into a traditional housewife and destroy everything they'd built together. When Monroe and DiMaggio married in January 1954, Lytess reportedly spent 3 days in her darkened bedroom, refusing to eat or see anyone. Friends who visited during this period described her as heartbroken, a word that carried implications they may not have fully intended. DiMaggio, for his part, saw Lytess as a rival, not just a professional obstacle. In arguments with Monroe during their brief 9-month marriage, he repeatedly demanded that she cut ties with her coach, that she recognize the relationship for what it was, an unhealthy attachment that had nothing to do with career development. Monroe's inability or unwillingness to make that break became one of the central conflicts of the marriage. DiMaggio later told confidants that he believed Lytess was in love with his wife, and that Monroe either didn't see it or chose not to acknowledge it. If Natasha Lytess was indeed in love with Marilyn Monroe, she was also trapped in an impossible situation. In the Hollywood of the 1950s, a woman in her position could not acknowledge such feelings without destroying both her career and her student's reputation. Same-sex desire, especially when it crossed professional boundaries, was not just taboo but potentially criminal under California's sodomy laws of the era. Lytess had to hide whatever she felt, express it only through the socially acceptable channels of professional dedication and maternal concern. Biographers who've studied Lytess's life have found intriguing hints about her sexuality. Before coming to Hollywood, she'd been part of European theatrical circles in Berlin and Moscow, where attitudes toward sexuality were more fluid. She'd never married, despite being an attractive woman who received proposals. Her closest relationships, aside from Monroe, were primarily with women. Studio personnel files from Columbia Pictures include a memo from 1949 in which an executive notes that Lytess should be monitored because of lifestyle concerns, a euphemism commonly used at the time to reference suspected homosexuality. But suspicion is not proof, and Lytess herself never made any public statement about her sexual orientation or her feelings for Monroe beyond professional admiration. The evidence exists only in behaviors that could be interpreted multiple ways. The intense focus on a single student, the jealousy toward Monroe's male partners, the physical closeness that witnesses described, the emotional devastation when Monroe ended their professional relationship. All of these could indicate romantic love, or they could simply reflect an unusually intense mentorship that crossed into unhealthy dependency without ever becoming sexual or romantic. Understanding Monroe's side of the relationship is even more complicated. Unlike Lytess, who maintained consistent behavior patterns throughout their 8 years together, Monroe's feelings seemed to shift and contradict themselves. In some moments, she defended Lytess fiercely, insisting that no one understood their bond, that the coach had saved her life and career. In other moments, she complained about feeling suffocated, controlled, unable to make decisions without Lytess's approval. In psychiatric sessions with Dr. Margaret Hohenberg starting in 1955, Monroe struggled to articulate what Lytess meant to her. Hohenberg's notes, which became public decades after both women's deaths, reveal Monroe describing the relationship in language that veers between daughterly affection and something harder to define. "Sometimes I think Natasha loves me too much," Monroe told her therapist. "Not like a teacher loves a student, more like how I imagine a real mother would love a daughter, or maybe how a lover would. I don't know. It makes me feel safe and trapped at the same time." The possibility that Monroe had her own romantic or sexual feelings for Lytess is the most speculative aspect of this story, supported by almost no direct evidence. Monroe identified as heterosexual throughout her life, married 3 times, had numerous documented affairs with men, but she also lived in an era when bisexuality wasn't acknowledged as a legitimate orientation, when any same-sex attraction had to be completely suppressed or categorized as deviance. If Monroe did experience confusing feelings for her coach, she had no framework to understand them, and every social reason to deny them. The end of the Lytess-Monroe relationship came in 1956, precipitated by 2 developments that converged to make their dynamic unsustainable. First, Monroe had begun studying at the Actors Studio in New York with Lee Strasberg, whose method-acting approach offered her a new path to artistic legitimacy. Second, she'd fallen deeply in love with playwright Arthur Miller, an intellectual who represented everything Lytess had wanted Monroe to value, but who also clearly threatened the coach's position in her student's life. Miller's arrival was different from DiMaggio's. This wasn't a jealous athlete who didn't understand Monroe's artistic ambitions. This was a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer who could engage with her intellectually, who encouraged her dramatic aspirations, who saw her as more than just a sex symbol. Lytess couldn't dismiss him as unsuitable or damaging to Monroe's development. Instead, she had to watch as Monroe transferred some of the emotional dependency she'd placed on her coach onto this new man who could offer things Lytess never could: social respectability, intellectual partnership, the possibility of a publicly acknowledged life together. The telegram Lytess received in 1956 informing her that her services were no longer required came while Monroe was in England filming The Prince and the Showgirl with Laurence Olivier. Paula Strasberg, Lee's wife, had accompanied Monroe as her new coach. Lytess was being replaced in every sense, professionally by the Strasbergs, emotionally by Miller. The 8-year relationship ended not with a conversation or explanation, but with a piece of paper delivered by Western Union. For someone who may have been in love with Monroe, who had certainly built her entire life around the project of creating and maintaining Marilyn Monroe, it was a devastation from which she would never recover. After Lytess's death from cancer in 1963, her sister began sorting through her belongings and found something unexpected: dozens of letters addressed to Monroe, written over the years but never sent. These letters, which eventually made their way to various archives and biographers, reveal the depth of Lytess's emotional attachment in language she'd apparently felt unable to use in person. Some letters are explicitly romantic, using terms of endearment that go far beyond professional affection. Others are anguished, describing the pain of watching Monroe with other people, the jealousy Lytess felt and knew she had no right to express. One letter, dated 1954 around the time of Monroe's marriage to DiMaggio, reads in part, "You asked me once why I never married, why I devoted my life to teaching instead of having a family of my own. I couldn't tell you then, but perhaps someday you'll read this and understand. I never married because I was waiting, though I didn't know it, for you. Not for a student or a project or a star to create, for you, Marilyn, the person behind all those things. I know this is wrong, I know I should be stronger, but how do you stop loving someone who has become the center of your entire existence?" These letters complicate the narrative in troubling ways. They confirm that Lytess did have romantic feelings for Monroe, but they also raise questions about consent and power dynamics. Lytess was in a position of authority and trust. Monroe was dependent on her for career guidance and emotional support. If Lytess harbored secret romantic feelings while maintaining a professional relationship, was that a form of exploitation? Or was it a painful sacrifice, keeping those feelings hidden to protect both their interests? In the 6 years between her break with Lytess and her death in 1962, Monroe occasionally spoke about her former coach in interviews and private conversations. Her comments reveal a complex mixture of gratitude, resentment, and incomplete understanding of what their relationship had actually been. To some interviewers, she described Lytess as a savior who'd believed in her when no one else did. To others, she talked about feeling controlled and manipulated. To her therapist, she expressed confusion about why the relationship had felt so intense and why its ending had been so painful. One particularly revealing comment came in a 1961 interview with W.J. Weatherby, a journalist Monroe trusted. Weatherby asked about her early acting training, and Monroe said, "Natasha taught me everything about performing, but I think maybe she wanted to teach me other things too. I was too young and stupid to understand what was happening. She needed me in a way that wasn't about acting, and I needed to be needed, so it worked until it didn't." When Weatherby asked her to clarify what she meant, Monroe changed the subject and never returned to it. Did Monroe understand that Lytess had been in love with her? The evidence suggests she had some awareness, but chose not to fully examine it, perhaps because doing so would have complicated her understanding of a formative relationship, or perhaps because it would have forced her to confront questions about her own feelings that she wasn't equipped to answer. In the 1950s, without contemporary language about emotional manipulation, power imbalances in relationships, or the spectrum of human sexuality, Monroe may simply have lacked the framework to process what had happened between her and her coach. If we accept the evidence that Natasha Lytess was romantically in love with Marilyn Monroe, the story becomes a tragedy of impossible love shaped by an unforgiving era. Lytess couldn't acknowledge her feelings without destroying everything. She couldn't pursue a relationship without ruining both their careers and possibly facing legal consequences. She couldn't even fully express her jealousy when Monroe chose men over her without revealing emotions that had to remain hidden. So she channeled everything into the only acceptable outlet, an obsessive professional dedication that gave her proximity to the object of her affection while requiring her to facilitate Monroe's romantic relationships with others. The psychological torture of this position is almost unimaginable. To spend every day with someone you love, touching them in the context of teaching physical techniques, listening to them describe their feelings for other people, watching them prepare for romantic scenes with actors, knowing you can never speak your truth, to have that person depend on you emotionally while being fundamentally unavailable to you, to build your entire life around someone who will ultimately leave you for socially acceptable partners. Lytess lived this reality for 8 years, and when it ended, she had nothing left. The most tantalizing and ultimately unanswerable question is whether Monroe felt anything romantic or sexual toward Lytess. The evidence is circumstantial at best. Monroe chose to live with Lytess for extended periods when she had other housing options. She became distraught when separated from her coach for too long. She described the relationship in language that sometimes veered into romantic territory. But none of this proves romantic attraction, and Monroe's clear pattern of heterosexual relationships suggests that if she felt anything beyond intense platonic attachment, she either didn't recognize it. Some biographers have speculated that Monroe's relationship with Lytess represented a kind of emotional intimacy that she couldn't achieve with men, a safe space where she could be vulnerable without the sexual complications that her relationships with men always involved. Others have suggested that Monroe's dependency on Lytess's approval reflected an arrested development, a search for the mother figure she'd never had rather than anything romantic. Still others point to the intensity of the bond as evidence that something beyond friendship existed, even if it was never physically consummated. The truth is probably more complex than any single explanation. Human relationships, especially those formed in the pressure cooker of Hollywood stardom, resist simple categorization. Monroe and Lytess may have both experienced their relationship as something unique, something that didn't fit neatly into the categories of friendship, romance, family, or professional partnership. It may have been all of those things and none of them, a bond shaped by specific circumstances that couldn't be replicated and couldn't be fully understood by either woman experiencing it. For decades after both women's deaths, the romantic aspects of the Lytess-Monroe relationship remained mostly hidden, mentioned only in coded language by biographers who couldn't or wouldn't make explicit claims. This silence reflected both the era's homophobia and Hollywood's investment in maintaining Monroe's image as the ultimate heterosexual fantasy. Any suggestion that she'd had an intimate emotional relationship with another woman, regardless of whether it was sexual, threatened the mythology that had been built around her. The studio system that controlled Monroe's career had worked hard to construct her as irresistibly attractive to men, as helplessly heterosexual as the embodiment of male desire. Her marriages to DiMaggio and Miller were publicized extensively as proof of her normalcy, her attainability, her place in conventional society. Evidence that her most important emotional relationship during her peak years might have been with her female acting coach didn't fit this narrative, so it was minimized, coded, explained away as excessive professional dedication rather than acknowledged as the complex emotional entanglement it actually was. Even now, with greater openness about sexuality and more nuanced understanding of human relationships, the Lytess-Monroe story remains controversial. Some Monroe fans resist any implication that their idol might have had complicated feelings for another woman. Some Lytess defenders argue that reducing her professional achievements to unrequited love diminishes her legitimate contributions to Monroe's development. The difficulty of discussing the relationship honestly reflects ongoing discomfort with ambiguity, with relationships that don't fit clean categories, with the possibility that one of history's great sex symbols might have been more sexually complex than her image suggested. Whether Natasha Lytess and Marilyn Monroe's relationship was love, obsession, unhealthy dependency, or some combination of all three, it shaped both women's lives in profound ways. For Lytess, her feelings for Monroe, acknowledged or not, became the organizing principle of her existence. Her career, her daily schedule, her emotional well-being, all revolved around this one person. When that person left, Lytess had nothing to fall back on. She died 7 years later, alone and largely forgotten, her greatest achievement credited to others, her deepest feelings never validated or returned. For Monroe, the relationship with Lytess established patterns that would repeat throughout her life: intense dependency on mentors and authority figures, inability to trust her own judgment without external validation, confusion about the boundaries between professional guidance and emotional manipulation. The fact that her most formative professional relationship may have been complicated by her coach's hidden romantic feelings added another layer of confusion to Monroe's already complicated sense of self. How do you understand your own development when the person guiding it had ulterior motives they could never acknowledge? It would be easy to reduce the Lytess-Monroe story to scandal, to focus on the sensational aspects of potential forbidden love in 1950s Hollywood. But doing so misses the deeper tragedy of two women trapped by their era's limitations, unable to fully understand or express what they meant to each other. Lytess couldn't acknowledge her feelings without destroying both their lives. Monroe couldn't examine the relationship honestly without confronting questions about herself she wasn't equipped to answer. They were both products of a time that demanded strict categorization of relationships and severe punishment for those who stepped outside accepted norms. If Lytess and Monroe had met in a different era, would their relationship have been different? Could Lytess have pursued her feelings openly, and could Monroe have responded honestly to them, whatever her response might have been? Could they have defined their relationship on their own terms rather than hiding it behind professional boundaries? These questions are unanswerable, but they invite us to consider how many relationships throughout history have been distorted by social constraints, how many people have lived their lives unable to fully express or even understand their own feelings. In the end, we're left with fragments, witness testimony about glances and touches that seemed too intimate for a professional relationship. Letters written but never sent, revealing feelings that couldn't be spoken aloud, patterns of jealousy and dependency that suggest something beyond normal professional boundaries. Monroe's confused attempts to explain why Lytess mattered so much. Lytess's devastation when Monroe moved on. None of it proves definitively what happened between these two women in those private moments, in that bedroom where the photographer found them, in the mirror room where they spent thousands of hours together. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some relationships are too complex, too shaped by their specific contexts to be fully understood by outsiders or even by the people experiencing them. Perhaps the truth of what Natasha Lytess and Marilyn Monroe meant to each other died with them, leaving us with only questions and incomplete evidence. What we can say with certainty is that their relationship was extraordinary, that it shaped both women's lives profoundly, and that it continues to fascinate because it touches on fundamental questions about love, power, creativity, and the human need for connection. The story of Natasha Lytess and Marilyn Monroe reminds us that behind every public image there are private truths that may never be fully known, and that the human heart, especially in eras of repression and silence, contains depths that even the people experiencing them may never fully fathom.